Association actually has the American Library Association actually has a document called the Library Bill of Rights, and this articulates our core foundations of information access and our non-discriminatory principles, stating that materials shouldn't be kept out of libraries based on the national origin, gender, sexuality, age of the author of the materials, nor should people be denied rights to those materials based on those items. In addition to the Library Bill of Rights and my core philosophy for why I do the work that I do, we have our First Amendment rights to free speech and freedom of press. And there have been Supreme Court cases, and Sarah could certainly probably speak to this better than I could, but Supreme Court cases about school boards, and it has been established that school boards cannot remove materials from school libraries simply because they don't like the content of the material, unless it meets the threshold of obscenity. And probably the thing that bothers me the most is throughout history, and certainly now, there's a disproportionate impact on marginalized people groups when we talk about books that are being pulled and are being challenged by our communities. And right now, those people groups are disproportionately LGBTQ communities and the people of color. But there's also been a historical trend of books about different religious groups and things like that. So it's always marginalized people groups that are disproportionately impacted by book bans. So before we move on to talking about our current challenges and our current situations, are there any questions or comments about anything that I've covered so far? Okay. So if you have been living and paying attention to the news at all lately, you know that we're experiencing an unprecedented level of book challenges, and everything that we are seeing at nationally is presenting itself on a smaller scale locally in Nebraska and in Omaha. So I want to take some time today to look at national trends and how they are manifesting themselves locally, and what we are doing about that and how you might want to become involved. So the first challenge that librarians face every day is misunderstanding. And this is what I want to share with you, and I'm hoping that you will be good stewards of my message and share with anybody that you understand. So we hear a lot in the community, like these librarians just want all kids, they're indoctrinating them, and they want them all to read all this stuff that we don't agree with. But that nothing could be farther from the truth. So librarians 100% support the right of parents to influence their children's reading material. And we work with parents, I work with parents regularly to make sure that their wishes are met for their child. The difference is we don't support your right to determine what my children should or should not read. And so we work with, we completely take seriously any concerns from our communities. We are taxpayer funded and we want to listen to what our taxpayers say to us, but we really try to solve these problems at the individual level, and rather than bringing them to this macro level. And if you don't want something for your child, we will absolutely work with you to do our very best to make sure your wishes are met, whether we agree with those wishes or not. The second thing I want people to know and understand is that school districts have policies and procedures in place that work beautifully to handle concerns in a civil manner and an appropriate setting. So that means two things. We don't need state legislation telling us how to handle these things, because we've had these policies and procedures in place for decades. We don't need somebody else to tell us how to do it. We've determined how to do it. And the second thing that I want people to know about that is be aware of what your district's policies and procedures are, because we get people, I call them repeat attenders, that show up at our school board meetings all the time and rant and rave about the books in our library. That is not how to get the attention of the school board about this issue. There are ways to file complaints, channels to go through, processes by which we very seriously take into consideration those concerns. What you get if you show up at the school board meeting is 5 minutes of fame and zero action. So that is the other thing that I want people to understand. You create a scene, it becomes a very public spectacle, but it doesn't really accomplish what you intend it to accomplish. And there are civil ways and appropriate ways that we can go about dealing with this without calling teachers and librarians purveyors of pornography. And finally, communication is essential. So if you have a problem with material that is in the school, communicate with the principal, communicate with your teachers, communicate with your librarians. But also, if a decision is made that you don't want your child to take out a certain kind of material, communicate with your child. You're the parent. And if they come to me and want a certain book and I tell them, honey, I've talked with your mom and I don't think that is a book that your mom wants you to bring home, that child better know what I'm talking about. They better understand what the parents' wishes are. I don't wish to be the bad guy in this situation. So it's very important to talk with your children about what your values are and what your expectations are for bringing home library material. So those are the things that I wish that the public understood a little bit better about the work that we do. The campaign to ban books nationally is organized and brought to the local level by local chapters of these fringe groups of people. And I have here a timeline of censorship by the numbers, and you can see that the book challenges have remained very steady throughout a considerable, for 20 years, essentially. And it is no accident that when you start seeing this sharp rise in numbers, I can tell you exactly what happened, and I'm sure you can figure it out too. It is a direct result of COVID. And these same groups that started organizing to protest mask mandates and other COVID restrictions, when that issue dissipated and was no longer a threat to their perceived well-being, they were already organized and they turned their attention onto book bans. So nationally, you can see we've seen this large spike in the last 3 years in the number of challenges, and locally you would see the very same thing on a smaller level. So I'm new to OPS. I've only been with the district for, this is my 3rd year. But I've worked with people on these challenges who've worked for the district for 20 or 30 years and have never before had a complaint reach the formal reconsideration level. And we've had 2 since I started with the district. And we've had a major increase in the number of parents contacting. There was a time last spring I was talking personally myself to probably at least 1 to 2 parents a week. And that's not the principals and the librarians. That doesn't include the principals and the librarians who handled things at the school level before I had to get involved. So we've seen the same kind of rise locally as well. For me, I do want to say just a thing about these challenges. And for me, the biggest source of frustration is the inordinate amount of time that they take and which distracts district staff from actually spending time on the work that really matters and spending time with our students. And one of our recent formal challenge that we went through, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, very conservatively estimating, I would say it took about 200 hours of district labor to get that whole challenge organized, write the reports and everything. And that doesn't include the time spent individually off the clock by people like myself who read over 1,000 pages of text at home on their own time, because who has time to read during the workday the books that were being challenged, over 1,000 pages of text. So it's an inordinate amount of time, and every time I have to deal with something like this, it's time that takes away from me being in the schools and being hands-on with kids. And that's what hurts me most about these challenges.
Amy, are those numbers national numbers? In other words, in 2003, there were only 305 titles nationally challenged, and now it's 2,571. Is that what that is?
Correct. Yes, national numbers.
Thank you.
And I gave Pam this set of slides, and I don't know, she was going to share them with you either before or after the meeting, but you will have access to all of this information and any links that are embedded within the slideshow as well.
Yeah, I'll send it out after we're complete the meeting.
Perfect. Thank you. So again, looking at the national level and bringing that to the local level, the top 13 most challenged books of 2022 are on this slide. And from bringing that to the local level, you'll see the #1 book challenged in 2022 was the book Genderqueer. That book made quite a splash in Nebraska when 2 of our legislators got in a Twitter war over this book. So there, I have included in this slide a link that you can go read about that exchange. All Boys Aren't Blue, that is the #2 challenged book. That book was challenged in Papillion La Vista and OPS in the last year. And there are local news articles linked there as well. And then #10 down here, Ellen Hopkins, Crank, I believe that was, I don't remember where else that was challenged, but Ellen Hopkins is one of the most challenged authors in general. She writes novels in verse, and the books tend to be edgy, I would say edgy. And so the book in our district in OPS that was challenged by her was actually her book Tricks, which is about child trafficking and prostitution. And Crank is actually about drug use, but her books tend to be very, very much challenged as well. And so we're seeing that same trend that they are challenged in Nebraska schools as well. And when I go back and say, you know, that right now the LGBTQ community is very significantly impacted by these bans or these attempts at banning, as well as people of color. Genderqueer is about gender non-binary people, and All Boys Aren't Blue is the story of a African-American queer person. So the point where those minorities intersect, like in All Boys Aren't Blue, is even more difficult for people to tolerate. So local legislative action in actually,
Yeah, Amy Rich had a question. Go ahead.
yeah, sorry.
Just curious, is if Huckleberry Finn has been challenged?
If a what?
If Huck Finn has been challenged.
Huck Finn, no. No,
Really?
Okay.
not locally. I mean, it is on the top 100 books of national challenges, but not locally. It has not been, not formally, and not during my time with the district.
Thank you.
Yeah. So in 2022, there was some local legislative action, and most of our legislative action in Nebraska hasn't focused on book banning, but it has focused on information access. And so there was LB 1213 in 2022, and this was an effort to place restrictions on material in periodical databases used in schools. Now, so these are the types of databases that provide access to resources such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, as well as peer-reviewed journals in a variety of different content areas. So this organized group wanted to place restrictions on that type of material, and they drew up a bill to really require that the companies that make these aggregate databases filter the material to make sure that there was nothing quote unquote pornographic in nature or sexually explicit in nature in these databases. They were not successful. The Nebraska Library Association, the Nebraska School Library Association, and the Nebraska Library Commission very successfully lobbied against that. They worked their butt off, recruiting people to write letters and call their legislators, and they worked very, very hard, and they were not successful in getting this legislation passed. But this legislation was based on a template created that has been attempted in many, many states. And while the filtering requirement, to the best of my knowledge, has not passed in any states, Utah and Texas have passed legislation that allows school districts to heavily fine and monetarily sanction companies if they believe that the database has allowed students to access material that is explicit. The problem with that, as you know, is these are databases that aggregate information about current world events. And unfortunately, current world events are violent and explicit. And that is the nature of our news today. So I'm very concerned about this type of legislative action and our students having access to quality peer-reviewed content to help them with their research processes as they progress through high school. So thankfully, this legislation did not pass, but it was one that was on our radar and causing us great concern for a while. So this is just a slide of some of the books that I've had to deal with parent requests about and titles that have caused more concern in our district within like the last year. So this, I already talked a little bit about All Boys Aren't Blue, Tricks, and Genderqueer. These are three that are big concerns. Genderqueer, I stayed at work quite late one night, probably 8, 9 o'clock, working with the communications department, because after our legislators had their Twitter war, we were asked some questions from local media about whether that book was in any of our libraries, and if so, why we would have such a book in our libraries. So I helped draft a communication that I don't believe was ever actually published. We worked very hard to draft a very logical and reasoned and calm explanation, and that didn't really suit the needs of the media at that time, I guess. So nobody really responded to that. Stonewall, a building, an uprising, and a revolution is actually personally, I found it to be a fascinating book. It's a picture book about the Stonewall Inn in New York City. And it's narrated from the perspective of the building itself, and starts out in the 1800s when the building was a horse stall, a barn, essentially. And the building is talking about all the different changes to the city and the neighborhood that it observed up until the time of the Stonewall riots and to present day and what Stonewall stands for today. It's a very age-appropriate, interesting look at the building and the Stonewall riots. But I've had a couple of parents complain about that book being available to students. Julian is a mermaid, again, an African-American young boy. Julian is dressing. He dresses up like a mermaid, and then his grandmother catches him, and he's afraid he's going to be in trouble. And it's a lovely little ending because the grandmother looks at him and he has her curtains tied around him as his mermaid fin and everything. And then she goes into her room and comes out with a pearl necklace and puts it on him to help complete his outfit. And Drama by Raina Telgemeier is a graphic novel, as is Genderqueer. And graphic novels tend to draw more attention because the images in them upset people more than just words do. So Drama is a story about a middle school drama troupe, and true to form, one of the female lead of the play is in fact a drama queen, and during a performance she has a hissy fit and runs off the show, and a young man who's been a stagehand but has a beautiful singing voice and knows all the parts dresses up in her costume, comes out, saves the show, and has to kiss the male lead in one of the scenes. And so there's two males kissing, and that draws fire for that book. So those are just some of the books that I've had to answer parent complaints about in about the last year or so. So that's all of the challenges that I was thinking about sharing with you right now, but I do want to kind of end on a high note and talk a little bit about some of the successes and the good things that are happening in our libraries and in our schools. Well, maybe before I talk about that, questions about any of those challenges?
I have a question. So one of the things that you mentioned involved, like, if parents come to you and say, like, we don't want our kid exposed to this, how does that work on a school level with like all of the kids? Like, do the librarians like send out stuff? How do they know what? I mean, before someone says something, I guess, to them, like, I can't believe my kid brought home this book. Is there like something that happens in regards to the kids' library access?
I'm not sure I'm following the question. How do the librarians know that that the kids don't want the books, or that the parents don't want the books?
Right. What is the process in which the school librarians know what parents feel what way about access to certain books?
Yeah, so we wouldn't know unless the parent contacts us, right? But if a parent does contact us, we put a note. Our library system is automated, and we put a note in the student record of our library system. And every time the student checks out a book, this note will pop up and say, you know, Johnny can't check out Diary of a Wimpy Kid books, or Johnny's parents prefer that he doesn't take out these kinds of books. And we do our best then when that note pops up to look through the books and make sure that the books that are going home are in compliance with the parents' wishes. Now, most of our books, most of our libraries have in the neighborhood of 10 to 15,000 books in them, and we cannot have read every single one of them. So it's very much better that the parent complaints be explicit in titles, or, if you told me that you didn't want your son to bring home books with LGBTQ content, there is I read enough books and I read enough book reviews to know which ones are going to be explicitly, but I'm never going to know if there's a passing mention of one sentence that there's a character in the book that has a male character that has a boyfriend. I'm never going to be able to know that about every book in the library, but I can, the more detailed the complaints are, the more likely we will be able to intercept and help the parents follow their wishes. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Ellie has a question.
Hi, thank you so much, Amy. This has been very interesting, but I wanted to ask just who introduced LB 1213?
I think it was Albrecht.
Thank you.
And when you get the slideshow, the link to that legislation is in there, so.
And are you concerned that that could come up again and again? I mean, it's not dead, is it? It can always come up again.
It can always come up. I'm hoping that they've moved on to other things, but yes, I mean, believe me, it's something we're monitoring very closely.
Carol? You're muted. You're muted, Carol. Carol, you're muted. There you go.
I'm so sorry. Can't seem to do two things at once. Very specifically, you say that there are books that children are not allowed to bring home. However, you have no authority to tell children what they can or cannot read while they're actually in the library, correct?
We would try to follow the parents' wishes. I mean, there are processes in place that, assure that the child doesn't take a book home. I guess we wouldn't be able to necessarily monitor if a child took a book off a shelf and sat in the corner. We wouldn't be able to monitor that completely. We have most of our complaints actually come at the elementary level, which is we have a little tighter control over what the kids do in that setting than we would at a high school or a middle school level. And I guess I should say also in regard to that, with the two books that did make it to the formal challenge level in the district, were books that are at the high school level. So yes, students could absolutely come in and read those without checking them out, and the librarian probably would be oblivious. But those made it to the formal challenge level because the people who filed the complaints, I'm not sure they even had students in the Omaha Public Schools. They lived in the school district, and they were not interested in having their child's record altered. They were interested in having those books pulled from the school district. So there was nothing I could do to, make amends with them or try to meet their needs. They were very specifically wanted those books removed for all students.
Thank you. And the other briefly, was there any legislation in 2023?
There has not been yet, no.
Janie has a question here and then David.
For years, I taught Anne Frank at one of the middle schools here in Omaha. And I know there was some controversy about it, maybe statewide, nationwide. Has that been resolved? And has there been any other problems with that or those types of books?
So Anne Frank itself, the original book, I haven't heard.
Yeah.
Yes, I haven't heard of a recently of a problem with the traditional book, but there's recently been a graphic novel adaptation of the Diary of Anne Frank, and that one is drawing some ire nationally. Again, I haven't heard anything about it locally yet, but it is drawing some attention nationally because it's a little more, she was a young girl who was just blossoming and was exploring her sexuality. And when you put that kind of content into a graphic novel format, it tends to draw people's attention.
Do you want to add, Scott?
No, it's there was also a few years ago a challenge with the reissuing of the diary and some material included in that edition that was from the original. But it's exactly what we've seen, well, not here, but in the years have been the graphic novel.
Okay. All right. David?
Yeah, hi. Thank you. That was a great presentation. And so my question, it's like part comment, part question. First from the outset, I really agree and support with, generally with everything that you're doing there. I'm not one of the crazy people who are very closed-minded in that regard. That being said, though, I have a question. Like, where are all these books coming from? Because it seems like they all popped up everywhere all at once. And I imagine that they're not from like the government procuring them, but must be like donated. So, there must be some movement there. And hold on, that's part one. The part two is more of the comment part of it. And, for the Jewish community, if you see everything going on in Israel and the attacks that's gone on there, it's kind of crazy, the amount of propaganda and stuff out there. And so as I look at this issue, and then also as you see in the news that some of the extreme leftist, orgs tend to, be almost pro Hamas in some of their thinking. And I do not want to divulge into a political conversation here. My real concern is though going forward, and not even so much about the LGBT or race issue, but in just general terms, like where is the stopping point? Like at what point do you cut it off and say, hey, this is too far or this is too much? Because it seems like we are trying to be inclusive and open the door, but there's no real defined process. Well, hey, this one maybe really is too much and we should get people's input on that. It seems like a lot of the calls are being made and then it's like, here, people, you have to deal with it. Now, and I will just end it in saying that, as far as books being available and stuff like that, I have no problem with that whatsoever. It's more of the process, and as we look forward and expanding and stuff like that, things to be aware of. And so, yeah, I would like to hear your comments on that. Thank you.
Yes. So where are the books coming from? The books are, so we purchase books, and we have, much like we have books for processes and policies for challenges. we have processes for selecting books that are included in our library. And we do have rules and regulations about what we do include. And so they have to have, unless they are of local interest, published by local small authors who maybe have not gained as large of a stage yet and provide some meaningful context for our community. The books that are published at a national level have to be have to have quality book reviews from places like School Library Journal, Hornbook, Book List, national professional book reviews that are published indicating, and those reviews always indicate an appropriate age range for them as well. So no, there is not, I wouldn't say there's a movement afoot necessarily to, there are all these, actually all these books didn't come out at once. It's just that now with our current time and our current climate, people are drawing, their attention is drawn to these types of books. So some of them, yes, are in response to certain situations. The George Floyd, the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, if you will, in my home state of Minnesota, A Dark Shadow, it certainly prompted a lot of books about diversity, especially for the African-American community. So politically, a lot of these books are in response to things that are going on. So again, we can't read every single book that we buy, but we do try to be well informed about what's in our libraries, and we read prolifically. It's been kind of a slump year for me reading, and I've read 108 books this year. Normally I read about 150 over the course of a year. So we try very hard to be aware of what's in our library, in our libraries, but we can't possibly be aware of everything. So we rely on professionals to tell us what's age appropriate and what would be fitting. And then we also take into consideration the community that we serve, right? So if we're serving a predominantly African-American school, we want to make sure that our library collections reflect the population that we're serving and that students see themselves in the literature that's available to them. So does that answer the first part of your question?
Yes. So let me just clarify one point. When I said that they'll pop up at the same point or everywhere, because you just mentioned like how it's like a local process, but then you also show the list. Well, hey, this is the #1 book that is challenged nationwide. So I mean, it seems like there is some sort of organized, movement to bring those books up, or to have them be available on that, on a nationwide basis, even if it is a local selection process. Which again, I don't have any problem with. I was just curious how the all went, but I think you answered that quite well. So yeah, thank you for that. But go ahead if you have anything more to say.
Yes, and I would say that in maybe I'm understanding your question a little bit more. The American Library Association documents, and to the best of their ability, that things are reported to them, what books are being challenged nationwide, and they document that and then publicize that. The second part of your question about where do we draw the line, it is a very fine line to walk, right, between freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and hate speech. And in a school setting, we have no tolerance for hate speech. And Hamas is a terrorist organization, and I agree with everything you said. And we have to be aware of all the people we serve. And again, just saying this again, just for qualifiers, I am not representing OPS necessarily with my views, but I'm just saying that we would hate speech doesn't have a place in a school library.
Yeah, well, great. And I mean, you know what? I think as long as you stick to those core principles and do it in good faith, I think we're going to all be in good shape. The thing that always worries me, and it's not just with this movement or anything else, is that well-meaning people or intended policies, if people step in that have the intent to abuse that or exploit it, then that's usually possible too. And so you need to be on top of it and be aware of these things, and people have to be strong enough to stand up and say, hey, this is not not right, but I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, so this is no judgment on you. Thank you.
I would go back to what I said in my introduction with regards to that I've sat on these committees before, and I mean, we're only human, right? We have to be willing. I believe in these core values that I hold with my whole heart, but we have to be willing to recognize that we are capable of making mistakes and to acknowledge that if we do, and say, you know what, this parent was right. This book really is not appropriate for an elementary school or for a middle school. And we have to do something about that. We have to be willing to admit when we are wrong. And that is unfortunately a problem. One of the problems I think we're facing in our world today is nobody's ever willing to admit when they're wrong. And so I did say in my introduction that one of the challenge committees that I sat on chose to restructure instruction in response to that complaint. And that just to give you a little more information about that one, it was a piece of music curriculum, and the title of the piece of music that was the complaint was filed against was Chippewa Lullaby, and it was filed by an Ojibwe parent who says, you know, Chippewa, and this is, you know, in my home area, my tribes that are in the area where I lived before I moved to Nebraska. Like, I'm Ojibwe. We do not call ourselves Chippewa. That is the white person's name for us, and we do not have lullabies. That is not the type of music. You know, it's a complete misnomer. So it's one small piece of music. There are many alternatives that could be used to teach the same concepts. And so we just said, you know, pick a different piece of music. You don't need to use this one to teach these concepts. So we admitted we were wrong. That particular piece of music was not appropriate. It was culturally insensitive. Move forward.
So Caitlin has a question, and there's a couple in the chat too, Amy, when you get it.
Okay.
I just, it's not so much a question. Well, I guess it's a little bit of a question. I think you did a great job explaining kind of where some of the, where you get ideas for new materials. I think the other thing to keep in mind is some of the groups that are actively pursuing book bans are highly organized. They might have local affiliates, but they are sharing titles with each other. So it's not a coincidence that the same titles are being challenged in multiple cities. And it's less, I think, to do with what's in the libraries and more to do with the folks that are trying to pursue these book bans, sharing that information with each other, especially with social media and things like that. So I don't know if you want to comment on that. That was more of a comment than a question, but I think that's something that we've been kind of seeing, especially with the internet. It's connected people and shared tactics and information in a way that we haven't seen before.
Yes, absolutely. There's a website, I'll tell you about it. It's called booklooks.org, and it's a website that very specifically calls out certain titles and tells people how to fill out complaints about these titles that they think are offensive. And so these two that we had challenges for were filed at different schools by different people, but the format of the complaint was exactly the same. The complaints were exactly the same, except for the title was changed. And so they coach people through how to file these complaints and give them the words that they should use. And the other piece about that I would say is I have never actually sat in on a challenge committee, with the exception of the one where we rescinded the piece of music, where the parent or the complainant actually read the book in its entirety. We take the complaints very seriously. We have a responsibility to do that. And in doing so, we have a responsibility to read the text in its entirety. So in those books, I'm thinking about All Boys Aren't Blue, there's probably a total of 4 pages that were kind of mature content. I would call them mature content in the context of 300 beautiful pages of the author expressing their experience. So we always take the complaints within the context of the whole rather than an explicit passage as well. And that is not the way the complaints are usually filed. I'm going to take a peek at these questions in the chat here. if we see that there is a book that is banned, how can you raise a concern about that? Well, a couple of things I would say. We're always looking, we always want to include community members on our review committees so that the voice of the community is heard. So if you hear there is one, now you'll have my contact information. You can reach out to me and volunteer to be a community member serving on the review committee. And you can, and this is going to be part of what you can do. Boy, I'm running out of time, I'm sorry. You can always show up at a school board meeting too and say, like, I know that these complaints have been filed and I want to speak out against the complaint and in support of the library and the book.
Okay, Sarah has a question.
So obviously this is a group of people who reads the news and is up to speed on what's going on. And there's been just kind of a horrific proliferation of like anti-Semitic materials that have been developed. What is like, you know, I know you said you can't read every book you purchase, but are there things in place that like help make sure that like anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist content, which is oftentimes just anti-Semitic, in fact, I would say 99% of the time is anti-Semitic, like, you know, knowing that we have large populations, growing populations, because we're immigrant resettlement locations of Muslim populations. So how do you like, you know, I guess like make sure that the content that is reaching, that you want to reach, like, you know, demographics isn't anti-Semitic?
It is increasingly hard to get professionally published books of that nature published, especially for a young audience. A lot of the books that deal with diversity that we buy for young people are really more about promoting peace and understanding of other cultures, and they're not about dragging down other cultures. It would be in the professional reviews, they would call it out in the professional reviews with a do not purchase or contains anti-Semitism. They would call that out in the reviews if it's spotted. And again, some people are oblivious. But I would hope that my fellow librarians who are writing professional reviews would spot it, would be cognizant of it. And if not, and you know that there is material that is anti-Semitic that in nature or contains anti-Semitic references in it in your libraries, file a complaint. By all means, file a complaint. We would never intentionally have that material available to students, and that is a personal promise that I make to you. But again, we make mistakes, and that is why we have the complaint process.
Thank you.
Okay, let's hear some of your successes.
Thanks. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the Nebraska School Library Association received the Academic Freedom Award on behalf of the Academic Freedom Coalition of Nebraska for their work on collaborating with the Nebraska Library Association to defeat LB 1213. So that was a huge honor. And this is OPS librarian Jessica Winter, who was on the advocacy committee for the Nebraska School Library Association, holding the award. So she accepted the award on behalf of the Nebraska School Library Association. And so that success in defeating LB 1213 was a huge accomplishment and something that we celebrated. School board actions, when you get the slideshow and are able to read all the news articles locally, you will see that OPS school board supported keeping those books. Papillion La Vista supported keeping the books. That is not always the case, but locally we've had school boards who have been very supportive of libraries. And I would say my administration, my supervisors, I have no fears of them not supporting. And going back to this thing that we've been talking about all along, it is not the majority of people. They are vocal and they are organized, but the majority of people are like-minded. that banning books infringes our civil rights. So that to me is just heartening. Those are the main successes that I could talk about right now. But I do also want to talk a little bit about how you can help. And I've alluded to some of these already, but first of all, school board meetings. And I told you we have repeat offenders. It is very rare. It is almost every school board meeting that somebody stands up to talk about the books that are in the library and complain about them. It is very rare that somebody stands up at a school board meeting at OPS or any of the local libraries, school board districts, sorry, and compliments librarians for the educational work that they are trying to do. And believe it or not, like our biggest concern at the school level often is literacy. I often half-heartedly joke that you shouldn't be concerned about the books that they're reading or the books that are in your library, because too many of our students can't read them anyway. So you can start worrying about the content of the books once we get the students' reading levels up to where they should be and they can actually read the books that are there. So every time we deal with these kinds of complaints, it takes time away from actually focusing on literacy. So if you would start showing up and singing the praises of the work of literacy and freedom of access to information, and of educators, that would be wonderful. Again, just monitor and respond to legislation. And if you have questions about like where the Nebraska School Library Association or Library Association might stand on certain legislations, reach out to me or reach out to those organizations and ask them. Spread the word about the things that I wish that people understood better. The fact that we are more than willing to work with parents to make sure that their wishes are met. And the final thing I would say was just like, if you know a librarian or you meet a librarian, be kind to them. It is not a glamorous time to be a librarian. We're at OPS, we have major library staffing shortages, and it's not really a good time to recruit people and ask them if they want to get 36 additional credits to become a librarian when people are going to stand up regularly and accuse them of distributing child pornography. So when that is the absolute opposite, we love children and we did not go into this work to harm children. So it's just not very glamorous work. So be just nice to them and encourage them in the work that they're doing. Those are the things that we most need right now. I do have these resources that will be coming out to you in the slideshow. I'm not going to go through them, but there are a lot of additional information for you to kind of follow through on if you're interested. And then if there's any more questions right now, I'd be happy to take them. Although I'm sorry, I've already gone over time by 2 minutes. I'm happy to answer anything.
Yeah, we should be okay for if anybody has more questions. And again, I'll send this out to everybody on the committee when we're done. Yeah, Amy, you did a great job. You've got a lot of fan club messages, fangirl boys in the chat. Are there more questions?
Amy, thank you so much for your time and putting this whole presentation together. It was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
You did a great job. Thank you. Okay,
All right.
got a lot of work to do.
Everyone else, you're free to go. That's it for our
Thank you,
meeting.
guys.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to go see some more family.
Okay.
Best of luck.
Thank you.
Thank you so
thank
much.
you.